Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. As we begin to close out 2024 and look ahead to 2025, I couldn't resist the urge to revisit some of my favorite guests from the last couple of months. While I'm grateful for everyone we've had on the show and all the support we continue to receive from the industrial cybersecurity community, I felt these comments were worth another listen, with a special focus being given to a handful of the most critical issues confronting our OT environments. First, we hear from Jon Taylor at Versa as he discusses a unique approach to patching and secure by design strategies that involve the development of embedded microsegmentation approaches. Next, we'll hear from CloudRange's Tom Marsland as he discusses the continued challenges presented by data silos and innovative ways to address the shortage of cybersecurity specialists. Then we'll turn to Baker Tilly's Jeff Krull as he reports on ransomware gangs and their combination of new and old tactics. And we'll finish up with cybersecurity researcher Jeremiah Fowler as he discusses some of the ongoing challenges about addressing persistent vulnerabilities. So when it comes to that architecture design, I mean, we're constantly having to reimagine it or re-understand what we have because there's more stuff being thrown at it. Now,
of course.
Is from a strategic perspective, do we have more of these vulnerabilities than popping up on the network because we don't have the visibility we should have, or is this still linking back to a lot of the fact we still have so much legacy equipment out there that wasn't designed with security protocols in mind?
So I like to call it archaic because that's about the right word. Yeah, I mean, it comes back down to that. I mean, look, I cut my teeth in IoT, or what we now know as IoT and OT. I've done a lot with medical and IOMT in my career, and it's interesting to see, like, I used to do design work. I actually started out being a drafter and doing design for electrical and so forth, building motor control centers, right, or designing motor control centers. How we got those online was we just slapped the circuit board in and slapped a PCI card in with a NIC and said, hey, this thing's online, and watch it run. How do you update that? You can't, right? It's impossible. And then thankfully, we fast forward 20 years. Yes, I'm that old. The gray in my beard, kind of makes me, ache my bones or something like that when I say it. But, realistically, it's, we fast forwarded, and you have companies like GE, you have companies like, Honeywell and so forth. They're starting to build a lot of this stuff with security in mind and have it be patchable, right? But then you still have an industry that says, if I patch that and it goes down for some reason, I lose millions of dollars, in minutes and hours of manufacturing. So they still don't do it. So you got to look at something. That's the reason why I come back to that network and that architecture side, right? Because if I can't do it on the end device, right, and patch that end device in such a way and keep it up to date, then I have to look at a network that can be adaptive, that can find and see and sense things like the common vulnerabilities that are coming out, right? The more severe vulnerabilities that are starting to hit market, and be able to prevent that type of traffic, those payloads, anything of that nature coming even into the network, or it being called out in such a way that it would even download its own payload and then be a place where a malicious actor could come in and make it a jump point or do data exfil, or even worse, weaponize, right, IoT and OT in some way, right, where it could actually harm a human.
Yeah. No, lots of interesting dynamics there, like you said, with you said archaic. That's your term. I try to be a little nicer, a little more sensitive there, but I can't argue with you in some cases. And that kind of leads into this other issue that we have. Depending on what stat you want to look at, manufacturing, the industrial sector, either the number one or number two most targeted sector that we have right now from a cybersecurity perspective. We know a lot of these issues. You just talked about some of these giants in the industry still not really responding to a lot of the threats that are out there.
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the biggest issues we have in just terms of getting a handle on this and really being more proactive and moving more quickly so we can get knocked down that list a little bit and not be so highly targeted or highly attractive to hackers?
So I think there's a couple things, right? So, and I focus, my career is plainly on the network, right? I do a lot with, everything from next gen firewalling to however, but, I also focus too, right? Being in security on, regular patching and just keeping systems and things like that. So I think there's a twofold process here, right? Number one is, let's take manufacturing, because I look at three majorly target industries, and I keep medical in that as well, with all the IoMT, type of devices, right? And whatnot that are there. Number one is that, as manufacturers come in and start and are building their solutions, right, it's a forever evolving, space. The downside to it is, once again, we have a lot of that archaic there, because, MRI machines, right, cost $1 million, right? Let's look at, manufacturing, facilities and so forth are millions of dollars. Legacy equipment, you can't refresh that like you can, an Amazon device or however, right? It's just not feasible, right? When you look at oil and gas and energies and things like that, the systems were designed to last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They weren't designed to be thrown away after every 5. So as companies are coming in and building toward that same motto, where these systems work for 20, 30, 40 years, and as corporations are taking investments that they've made over time and bringing them onto the network, we have to look at, from a security aspect, number one, how do we design for future patches in such a way that it doesn't hinder productivity, right? Can I patch on the fly? Can I keep something running without maybe having the brain actually work? And then therefore I can continually patch the head-end node, or I can continually patch the control center, the brain, however that is, on a regular basis. Like, let's take there's systems out there that might still be running Windows 2000, because the way it was built, if I upgraded to Windows XP to Windows 7 all the way up to Windows 11, it breaks my communication with that IoT type device. We got to keep in mind, how can I continue to go further, even though that device may not be upgraded in the same in the same fashion, and then keep the lines of communication segmented in such a way that only control communication goes across, right? Only certain communications that need to access that device goes across, while we're able to actually, physically, from a networking perspective, protect that device from ZTNA, right? Either on the wire or whether it's coming through Wi-Fi or however, be able to protect that device so it alone doesn't have the ability to call out. It alone doesn't have the ability to be compromised, because it cannot be patched but maybe 2 times a year. So I think that's number one, right? And then on number two is, we dive further into that architecture, where we're saying, from a manufacturing aspect or from an oil and gas or however, we have to have continuity of business, right? We can't take the plant down. We can't take something like that offline. So we have to have systems that we can routinely upgrade and build redundancy into, that if I upgrade a switch, if I upgrade, a firewall, a router, however that is, I can be able to do that in real time in such a way that the plants don't go offline and that the equipment still runs autonomously if communication is something like that it is broke, right? And I think that from a networking perspective, we've been able to do that now, primarily about what we've done in the enterprise space and things like that, because we take that redundancy in mind, but we're still not tackling what we're doing from an OT and a device perspective, as well, because we're just now starting to architect for that and build these machines to have redundancy and have systems in place that allow you to do that.
Well, that's interesting. We always talk about secure by design. And in some cases, when for products we talk about design for manufacturing, it kind of feels like you're talking about combining those, and design for patching essentially is what we need to put forward there. And that's interesting. To oversimplify, are we almost talking about, as part of that, like an embedded micro segmentation type of approach to that?
That's where I kind of lean toward, right? Is being able to do an embedded microsegmentation. I also say, I don't say design for patching, I say more like design for continuity. Think about it like that, right? It's device. I use this example quite a bit, right? So if I'm in a car manufacturer, for instance, I've got a robotic arm, it reaches over, it grabs the car door, right? And it pulls the car door on the side of the car and they weld it on. Great, right? So what happens if that arm goes offline for any reason? Well, we're going to have a lot of cars coming through without any doors on it, because it's all automated at that point. Well, what happens if I need to upgrade or I need to update or patch the operating system on that ARM? How can we have a solution in place? And I think, like I said, we've done this in the IT side where we can update like an offline hard drive, right, or an offline, type of memory, and then we can flip to that, automatically, and we lose nothing, right? The continuity of business, the continuity of action still is there. You might have a millisecond of offline time, right, as it flips to the new code. But once again, right, we're able to continually patch and upgrade and have continuity of business because we have that. And I think that's where we've come in the IT side. But kind of putting that all together, right, is the microsegmentation portion is that, yes, you are kind of designing to microsegmentation on a network. You're designing to microsegmentation within the own system itself. Because once again, I can upgrade that head end, but I have to make sure that only certain communication can go from that head end, that controller, that master computer, right? Whether that's to an MRI machine, whether that's to an automatic guided vehicle, whether that's to an oil drill on an oil rig, however that is. I've got to maintain that level of communication, right? Is only sending, what it needs, right? And not erroneous communication to it. And then in that process, I also have to have that microsegmentation set up on the network to say, if that box sends something that it shouldn't send, we block that at the device level, right? At the switch port, and say, you're not allowed to do this. This device is protected. And if it is compromised, the blast radius for that device is now limited to the device and not east-west.
Yeah, brilliant strategy. We just need to get there, get a little more buy-in on it. It's interesting. And how does that potentially lead into culture? Because I think that's becoming a bigger part of industrial cybersecurity as well. Is it's not just about the tools, it's not the firewalls or anything else you're putting in place, but having everybody buy into it. And that starts at the top and comes all the way through the organization. What have you encountered there in terms of best practices or getting everyone to embrace it to instill a culture of cybersecurity as opposed to just performing for the exercise from time to time?
Yeah, so we really focus on those incident response teams and not the broader organization, which the culture of security really does need to permeate the entire organization. But one thing that we really noticed working with the industrial teams is we've seen almost a chasm, especially when I first started here 2 years ago, almost a chasm of communication between what I'll call your traditional kind of corporate IT SOC teams that exist at those businesses and the people on the factory floors configuring these PLCs and doing that work. The IT teams don't understand the importance or maybe why those OT systems in some cases can't be patched or remediated. And the OT teams not necessarily are understanding the importance of the cybersecurity practices. They're so engaged in the work they're doing to keep those systems running. So one thing that we get a lot of benefit from is just bringing those two teams to the same table together and getting them to talk, getting them to share their processes and why these things are important. That's really the biggest benefit across. And then, across the entire Cloud Range organization, some of the things that we ask all of our participants to provide is, hey, do you feel like the training that you're coming through with us is going to help you be better prepared? Do you feel like it's contributing to your career growth? And we also ask every participant, because sometimes they aren't sharing this with management, what skills are they interested in learning? What sides of cybersecurity are they interested in getting into? And we pass that along as metrics. So we've seen a lot of improved retention and growth from those teams.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, those silos, that's something we've been hearing about for a long time. The IT and the OT folks not getting together, being a little territorial at times in terms of whose responsibility it is. And we know we're getting better. Over time, we have gotten a little bit better in bringing those teams together. Do you feel, or do you have a gut feeling in terms of maybe who needs to take the bigger step going forward? Does OT need to understand IT better? Does IT need to understand OT better? Is there one area that maybe needs to work at their reaching across the aisle a little bit more?
There's obviously no right answer here. But I really think the onus is on the IT teams that have that cybersecurity background as they kind of grew up in that industry. The OT teams are more focused on, the configuration of those devices, the making that system function. And it's not that they're not interested in learning, it's just that they haven't really been taught how important that can be, especially as technology has evolved and as the threat landscape has matured. More and more of these systems whether it's a cost savings measure for the company or whatnot, have been connected to networks for better or for worse, for things like monitoring. And so that has opened the aperture of that threat to those OT systems, where 10 years ago, most of those things weren't connected at all. And we're still seeing a lot of things that come to the basics of cybersecurity, asset identification and management, even tracking how many OT systems do you have in your environment and where are they connected. We interface with organizations from government to enterprise that may not even be able to give us a clear answer of what systems they have and where they're connected.
Well, is that an area where these attack simulations can help? Because I agree with you 100%. Visualization is probably the biggest challenge we have right now in terms of understanding, as we're adding all these automation assets, understanding just how big of a landscape we have to protect. Can going through these simulations be a part of the process in uncovering and achieving a better level of visualization?
Absolutely. I think we do a pretty good job of focusing on what's relevant in the threat landscape today. We're still seeing a lot of issues with simple things, password reuse, credential stuffing, just common misconfigurations that if you read any of the notices that come out, either IT or OT from CISA or from InfraGard or any of these things, these are misconfigurations or vulnerabilities that have already been broadcast out there, and we're able to still continue to highlight the need for focus there. I think one thing that we bring to the table in pointing out how common these things still are is that hopefully these teams are taking those lessons and taking a good internal look at their own systems and just rethinking about that, keeping it top of mind. It isn't... A lot of these attacks that we're seeing in these systems aren't this niche 0-day vulnerability that's being targeted. It's a lot of the basics, and I hope that we're highlighting the need for these employers to identify that it's not just about adding another tool to the arsenal that we think is going to solve all of our problems for us. When I talk about the cybersecurity skills shortage, we have a ton of applicants. We have a ton of people that are looking to make their foot into cybersecurity. I think that we have a problem today with employers really not willing to cough up some of the cash and broaden those teams and bring on enough people that they can have a patch management program that's remediating all of their devices in a timely manner. And they can focus on tracking down that shadow IT that might exist. And some of those attacks that we demonstrate in the range are highlighting those things that may or may not be applicable to their organization, but I'm willing to bet in most cases they are.
Absolutely. Well, I was going to wait to bring this up, but this is a nice segue into another role that you have in addition to working with Cloud Range. You're also the executive director of an organization called VetSec. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about your work there and how that's helping with some of these, some of the openings or some of the need we have within security.
Absolutely. I appreciate that a lot. VetSec's a labor of love for me. It's a volunteer position, kind of my nights and weekends. But VetSec's a 501c3 nonprofit with the vision to create a world where no veteran pursuing a career in cybersecurity gets left behind or goes unemployed. We do that by partnering with a lot of the industry training providers from CompTIA to Fortinet, and provide free or discounted training to the people who have served in uniform. That's active duty, that's reservists, that's retirees and veterans. I joined that organization when I was transitioning out of the military myself a couple of years back, and very quickly was asked to kind of jump in and help, and now they won't let me go. So, but we partner with a lot of those training organizations to provide that training to veterans. And then I think today now we can officially say we have one of the largest networks of veterans in cybersecurity to date. We use Slack as a communication platform for our entire membership base, and we have over 7,500 veterans communicating there every day now. We also run an annual conference called VetSecCon, all virtual and completely free to anybody, not just veterans, out on the internet, and that actually kicks off tomorrow for a three-day affair. So it's been a great organization to be a part of, and I love what we can bring to the table there to help those veterans out.
No, it sounds like an amazing group. Is there a website or something, or some way some folks, if they want to get involved, can reach out and be a part of that?
Absolutely, vetsec.org. And if anybody's interested in the conference, it's at vetseccon.com. We take applications. My volunteers process those daily, and we not only serve United States-based veterans, but veterans from any friendly foreign nation as well.
Very interesting. That's awesome. Well, I think one of the things with industrial cybersecurity, with the industrial sector, we get really frustrated at times because it's not just that we're getting hit, it's the quantity. It's the number of successful attacks that we continue to hear about. Even though we see different stats about the number of reported incidents or the number of reported incidents where the victim's paid is dropping or things like that, there's still just this onslaught of focus when it comes to the hackers hitting industrial and manufacturing facilities. What is your observations and why maybe manufacturing is a little bit slower to protect itself against ransomware compared to maybe healthcare or the financial markets?
Well, I think it's interesting, right? Because I think manufacturing runs into a problem that in a lot of cases, you can't really have a fully redundant system, right? So for all those manufacturing systems, all the OT, all that stuff, right? It's just not practical. You'd say like, well, every machine's going to have 2 versions of whatever that system is so that if one goes down, the other can just pick up. Because of that, you lose that redundancy. So an attack can become much more significant, right? They can extract that value for themselves. They can get you locked up and needing to pay the ransom or just being disrupted because there isn't a ready backup, right? It's not like you can say, it's not like email where you go, well, we have immutable backups on our email and we'll just recover it somewhere else and we'll get that back up and running. When you're talking about, especially manufacturing systems, things like that, there's just no practical way to have a quick recovery, to have that hot boom, you just move to the next thing. And without that hot boom, you move to the next thing. It becomes a bigger target for them because they know they are more likely to be successful. And they don't need everybody to pay the ransom. It's all a factor of how easy is it to get stuff locked up and then what percentage you're going to pay a ransom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not always as easy as just kicking out the cord and trying to reboot or start over anymore. That's for sure. I think one of the things that's interesting too here is when we talk about ransomware, there's been a lot more transparency. I think a lot more information is being shared now. What are some of the benefits, I guess, you're seeing from a little bit more transparency, a little bit more sharing of information? Unfortunately, that's a byproduct of more hacks and more attacks, but there are some things that we're learning out there, I'm guessing, right?
There are. I think organizations are getting, with a little more information sharing, people are getting quicker about how to head off some of the new ransomware vectors as they come up, right? So we're not seeing as much of that brand new vector for a while there, it felt like people were getting locked up with ransomware where you kind of scratched your head and you're like, well, it's been floating around for like 2 years. Like, why is this happening still, right? So I think some of that has helped with the information sharing. It's still only as good as what people share, though. I mean, my experience is a lot of organizations don't share the really ugly, dirty skeletons of how they got, breached and how somebody got in or what they weren't patching or why they weren't segmenting a network or things like that. They leave that out of the discussion. They're just like, oh, they found this vulnerability and this is how they attacked it. So,
yeah. Is there been anything you mentioned a couple times here how the hackers they're evolving, they're getting more complex, their organizations are becoming more adept and better at what they're doing essentially. In your research and in your investigations, has there been a group or a tactic that really caught your attention or maybe a level of sophistication that really surprised you even though you're very familiar with this stuff?
I am actually usually most surprised by how unsophisticated a lot of the attacks are. How they initially get in. Once they get in, it can be sophisticated. But how many organizations, they get in through email, right? And they use that to just start poking their fingers, figuring out what's there. They start the whole setting up a separate chain, a separate email account, fake email accounts, all that. It's not that sophisticated, right? Once somebody gets in email, and I would say that still feels like one of the top ways when you really peel it back. So many of these stories start with, they were in our email for 6 months. And once they were in the email, then, you can reset passwords, you can know when things are happening. I mean, we always joke, not in this sort of ransomware, but also wire fraud related. It's like, never accept wire change orders on a Friday afternoon before a holiday, because they're always bad, right? It's like if somebody says right before July 4th weekend, let's change those wire instructions, it's like, just don't do it. Wait till next week,
Exactly. Well, and it's crazy. We don't think about it, but even things like the URLs that we use for logging into different systems, software, all of that is obviously housed in our email. And then if we do a password reset or whatever the case is, you're right. That's just the easiest access point potentially for a hacker. So when you look at industrial organizations, you mentioned you thought email is still the biggest soft spot from a security perspective, because we hear a lot of, all these endpoints and everything else that's going on too.
I actually believe it is, because I think the endpoint, you have to get in an environment to exploit those endpoints.
Okay.
I'll admit I don't have hard data around it, but it feels like almost every breach, you hear email somewhere in the story. It's like it's always in the story. So even though people say like, wow, we didn't segment this stuff off, and we probably should have, and there were no patches. The vendor doesn't even support patching anymore, so we knew we had to run something old. You hear that part of the story, but somebody had to get in, right? And it's the getting in piece that often it's because they managed to breach their way into email. The question I always have is, and nobody likes when you ask this question, but were they unintentionally let in, or were they intentionally let in? Like, and it's hard to peel that stuff back, but I always say, a lot of organizations, for enough money, you pay somebody something, they're going to click that link that lets them in, type of thing.
Very interesting. When we look at email, yes, it's a technology. Yes, we're sharing a lot of information that way. And we even have data points that just come automatically or fed into our email at times, especially in the industrial sector. We're tracking all this stuff and looking at things remotely. Do you think the solution there, and I know this is a bit loaded, is it technology-based, or does it go back to just the human factor? Does it go back to the human element and just training our employees a little bit better?
I think it's a little in between.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of organizations fail the least privilege concept. So they give too many people standing access to too much stuff, right? So when they get breached, because everybody's going to get breached, you have to go in with the starting off point that given a long enough time frame, every organization is going to experience some kind of breach, right? So then the question is, once they're in, how much access do they have? Because they haven't probably breached every single account in an organization. And they will go after administrators, in fairness, right? But a lot of times people default to, well, we have these 30 people who work on this, so all 30 people need access all the time to be able to go change something. It's hard to challenge yourself and say, maybe they don't. Maybe only 3 of them do. And the other 27, if we need to turn on their access, we can have a process to go turn on their access, turn off their access, or some type of break the glass account for when we need to get in those things. That's where I think, that's why I say it's not really people. It's also not really technology. It's sort of like how you use the technology. You're actually, spending that time to limit access just to the minimum somebody needs, because that can undo a lot of damage, or prevent a lot of damage quickly, right?
Yeah, we've had a couple of folks on the show that have mentioned a similar type of tactic, using that time-based access protocol in terms of limiting the number of folks that can get in there, or just setting it up for a certain amount of time, whether it's a contractor, an employee, or whatever the case may be. Makes a lot of sense. So, Jeff, looking at the threat landscape, really, especially in ransomware, it seems like we get into an international scene very quickly. A lot of state-sponsored actors out there. What are you seeing right now in terms of the role that some of those state-sponsored or hacktivists, or whatever they want to call themselves, are playing now in the industrial scene? We've seen that kind of trickle down now away from more infrastructure to just traditional manufacturing.
My take is I think it's a little bit of a side gig for them, for the state-sponsored. But I also think, you look at some of the states, they take a very long-range view on the world, right?
Yeah.
So they may not be thinking, how am I going to cripple this industry tomorrow, or in 5 years, or in 10 years? They're potentially thinking ahead, going, hey, let's keep attacking. Let's keep figuring out where the vulnerabilities are, because if we go to war with this country, what if we could lock up all their industrial activity in a day? What if we could, knock them all out quick? So I think there's obviously the cat and mouse, but I do think there's an element of, that's why we see some of these broader testing, figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and why they want to do it. Because and again, I also think there's an element of stealing IP that may happen under our nose that people don't even realize.
Yeah, we know there's certain countries out there that are really good at that. In the past, they were much less subtle than going the digital route in terms of just basically picking something up and reverse engineering it and going from there. Maybe it's interesting in the industrial sector. One of the issues that we still come across is we have a lot of individuals, whether it's on the plant floor, in the IT department, or even in the executive suite, the CISO type station. They understand the issues. They're still struggling, however, to get funding. They just can't get, whether it's the board or the people that control the purse strings, to really divert a lot of resources to cybersecurity. Has there been anything that you've seen, whether it's messaging or tactics or approaches, whatever the case may be, to help reinforce the need for those funds throughout the enterprise?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, the average cost of a data breach now is in the millions of dollars. And there's no real way to measure the lost trust because, that's the big thing too. And depending on how sensitive your customer's data is, and especially like in an industrial space, or like, let's say you are a CRM or CMS provider. So you're dealing with like multi-tiered data. You're dealing with companies that use your product or service, and then the end customer. So you can have, some of the biggest, most diverse data breaches I've ever seen were from, companies that provided the CRM or, a type of service that manages the data of many different businesses. My advice would be to bring in the C-level executives or whoever's controlling the purse strings, because ultimately, if they understand the risk and they understand not to put all your eggs in one basket, understand that the vendors you use or the third-party contractors you use, you lose control of that data. Make sure they have a really big insurance policy, because no one wants to be on the hook for providing, lawsuits, or if you have to provide credit monitoring or anything like that. So helping the top executives fully understand that there is a real world cost to making sure that data is secure. That's step one. Some people get it, some people don't.
Yeah. Well, I think, connecting the dots here with the OT security space that we really target our audience with, there's always that place where you have to start. And we've seen this in a lot of big industrial organizations. They start on the IT side with a lot of these software platforms, ERP being a huge part of the manufacturing enterprise or the industrial enterprise. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is you came across a really interesting breach that's centered around an ERP company, ClickBalance, based out of Mexico. And I'll kind of let you take it from there, Jeremiah. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how you discovered this situation and what it all turned into.
Yeah, so, and that's the thing. There are many smart people all around the world. I've worked I live in Europe now, but I lived in Ukraine. And, we're just talking about Mexico is becoming an outsourcing hub, the same way that Ukraine was an outsourcing hub, because young, smart people realize that you can control your destiny, work how you want, and you don't have to go through this traditional bureaucratic layers of a real world business. And so IT is really something that you can do from anywhere in the world. When I'm looking for data, the first thing I do is I see what it is, and then I try to validate the finding. And I'm always looking for data. So when I found this, I saw that there was just under like 1 billion records. I think it was 769 million. And inside of that, there were like 380 something thousand email addresses. And that opens an entire can of worms, because one of the biggest risks right now to security, yes, of course, ransomware, of course, malware, but social engineering is a huge issue. And especially when you're talking at a corporate level, if you're going through and you're looking and researching who are the key players, who are the top people, who has access to what, and if you target them, you already have their email address, you already have internal data, you already have many of the tools you need for a successful social engineering campaign. And so when I find it, I try not to leave a database open for long. I really try to, I never download the data I find. I try to do like a limited sample of everything, get a real understanding of what's there, and then I send a responsible disclosure notice. So in this case, I sent the responsible disclosure notice. They closed it down immediately. It's not uncommon, but I didn't hear anything back. And there's many reasons for that. Some companies just want to put their head in the sand. Some companies just don't trust. They're like, oh no, I'm not falling for this scam. They hacked us.
Yeah.
And I've heard this before, and that's unfortunate that we live in that world where fear dominates response, but it doesn't help your customers and it doesn't help your data. Having a good response plan, because I'm here to tell you, doing this for 10 years, it's not if you had a data incident, it's when. And being proactively prepared is just as important as having a response plan, because then you're not running around blind. You know who's responsible for what's your messaging going to be, your key stakeholders you have to reach out to. And so I don't really know the fallout of that. And they've been in business for 25 years. I saw a lot of IP addresses from the United States, Canada, and with free trade and the networking between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and probably around the world, who knows what, how big they were or the outreach that they had to their customers.
Well, 769 million records tells you they have quite an extensive reach and into a lot of different industrial sectors, or different sectors, I should say, business areas. Do you know what vulnerabilities were exploited, how the hacker was able to get in and steal this much data?
Well, this was a misconfigured database. So, as to the best of my knowledge, no hackers were in there yet. But in the limited sampling of documents that I saw, I did see access keys. I saw secret keys. I saw things that if the bad guys got, they could dig much deeper. Because, in my case, when I find a non-password protected database, even if I see passwords and everything there, I never use them. That's the whole point of being an ethical researcher, is you never bypass credentials. But the real, concern here is companies that provide a service, and this is a very valuable service. It helps companies with their billing, with their inventory, invoicing. So this is a very valuable service that the industrial sector needs. But what happens is when you have an application or you have a dashboard, all of those files have to be stored somewhere. And the problem is where you run into getting from point A to point B. So a lot of times they'll be stored in a cloud storage repository, and the whole database will be password protected, but the individual files are open so they can be delivered through the dashboard. And the problem with that is once you see that file path, you can track it back. And then 9 times out of 10, you can see every document that's in the entire database.
Wow. So when you say misconfigured, this was just basically there weren't the layers of security that would be necessary to protect all this individual data.
No, not at all.
Wow.
Yeah, it was completely open. I mean, anyone with an internet connection could have seen it if they knew where to look.
So is this something that you see a lot of? Is it just one of those things where why would somebody target us, or is it just maybe, I'm not trying to really get after click balance here, but is this sort of a sloppy lack of segmentation? Was this just not doing their homework? What kind of proliferates this type of situation?
There's a big range of why this could happen. So, I can't, when a company doesn't comment, they don't put their side of the story forward. That's the thing. And like I said, mistakes happen to my company. And the thing is to learn from that and to grow from that. I've seen databases from Fortune 100 companies that were also misconfigured. It's not as common now, but it could happen because, let's say, someone changed the firewall setting. During COVID, when everyone was working remote, I saw a tsunami of exposed data breaches. because so many employees needed to work remotely, they needed access. So by giving one person access, you made a mistake and gave everyone access. And it was a gold mine for whoever's taking data. And, there are nation states that are actively harvesting data. So that's the real risk also. Yes, an ethical security researcher found it, notified you, did the right thing, but you don't know who else got it or what they can do with it in the future.
Thanks again for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or MBTmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.